Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. And so today's session is devoted to, as you know, to the far-right riots of July and August 2024 in the UK. And in order to analyze these riots, we've got three presentations. And the first one would be actually presented by Karine Tournier-Sol, who's a professor of British Studies at Toulon, and a specialist of the populist and radical right. So is there anything I need to add, Karine, to that?
No, that's perfect.
Over to you, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. You can see my screen, okay? If I just, then moving on. Okay, thank you very much, Vincent. So here, indeed, I'm going to focus on the far right dimension of the riots. Following the murder of 3 young girls on the 29th of July at a dance class in Southport, false rumors spread quickly on social media about the alleged identity of the attacker, who had been rapidly arrested by the police. The young man was presented as a Muslim asylum seeker, an illegal immigrant who had arrived in the UK by small boat. In fact, he was 17, born in Cardiff to parents from Rwanda, and had no known links to Islam. Violence erupted in Southport 1 day after the attack and targeted a local mosque. In the following days, disorder and riots quickly spread to several towns and cities across the country, mostly in England. As reflected by the very title of this webinar, these riots have been dubbed far-right riots, which tends to suggest that they were organized by specific groups or parties. This may seem paradoxical at first sight, as the British far right appears as a diminished force today, and this is therefore counterintuitive. In fact, as you will see, it is not that simple, and no one owned the riots. They were not organized by one single structure or organization. As a starting point, it is necessary to define the term far right here. In fact, it is an umbrella term comprising two different subtypes, the extreme right and the populist radical right. While the extreme right has its roots in fascism or neo-Nazism, the populist radical right has no such heritage, or it has succeeded in transcending it. What distinguishes them is their attitude towards democracy. The extreme right is in essence anti-democratic and rejects the democratic political system and democratic values, while the populist radical right tends to accept the rules of parliamentary democracy, but denounces the way democracy works in contemporary society, more specifically representative democracy, to which it favors popular democracy, but the populist radical right plays the political game, contesting elections and seeking representation. So it means that here, when talking about the far right, we're talking about a large right-wing ecosystem, which also includes Nigel Farage and his party Reform UK, which have just gained an unprecedented representation with 5 MPs in the House of Commons, thereby extending the scope and influence of the far right. So the aim of this paper is to explore the various forces at work in the riots and what this episode says about the current British far right. The first part will focus on the extreme right, trying to understand its role in this crisis, will allow us to look into its new form, which has been described as post-organizational, raising new challenges, as demonstrated by the riots. And the second part will delve into the populist radical right, analyzing the role of Nigel Farage and his party during the crisis, but also in the long term, as a major agent of the mainstreaming of the anti-immigration discourse in the UK, which has also extended to the Conservative Party and which forms the background to these riots. Okay. First, analyzing the role of the extreme right in this episode gives us an insight into its new form. The riots revealed a new pattern with 2 different levels: far-right influences spreading disinformation on social media, and then a decentralized organization on the ground from local groups reflected the fragmented form of the current extreme right. Typically, disinformation was first spread through Telegram, which has historically been largely used by far-right activists, then migrating to major platforms with a wider audience like X or Facebook. There, extreme right influences played a major role in the propagation of disinformation, greatly amplifying its reach. A variety of actors with large online following can be identified here, who clearly whipped up unrest through social media. The first one is Tommy Robinson, who's the leading and emblematic figure of the British extreme right, its most high-profile activist. Robinson, whose real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, he's a former BNP member, co-founder and leader of the English Defence League. And it's interesting to underline that he had held a demonstration in London on the Saturday before the stabbings, which had gathered more than 20,000 people, the largest number in years. So it shows that Robinson has a substantial following, which has grown further since he was reinstated on X by Musk last year, after having been banned in 2018. And he currently has 1 million followers on X. Robinson was not in the UK at the time of the unrest. He had left the country on the eve of a court hearing. He was in Cyprus, but he fanned the flames from afar. He was also among those who legitimized the riots, tweeting that the rioters were justified in their anger. And he later contributed to spreading the narrative of two-tier policing in the riots, which refers to the idea that white right-wing protesters and rioters are treated more harshly by the police. Other extreme right high-profile influencers also shared disinformation, thereby amplifying its reach, such as Lawrence Fox, who's a friend of Tommy Robinson, and has shared platforms with him. He has 535,000 followers on X, where he tweeted, "For decades, British girls have been raped by immigrant barbarians, and it's war." So that tweet was viewed more than 3 million times at the time of the riots. And he also circulated the narrative of two-tier policing. Andrew Tate, the extremist British-American influencer who has nearly 10 million followers on X, also took part in disinformation, claiming the attacker was an illegal migrant and calling for people to wake up. These influencers therefore reached an extensive audience beyond the spheres of the traditional extreme right circles. Moreover, at a lower level, local activists took the lead from these far-right figures and acted on the ground. The organization of the riots was decentralized, reflecting the fragmented form of the current extreme right. The riots were not organized by one single organization or structure, and this is representative of the new form of the extreme right, and it makes the riots themselves harder to grasp. Indeed, the extreme right has undergone a transformation in recent years. It is now described as post-organizational, meaning that it does not rely on traditional party structures and organizations anymore. Historically, the British extreme right draws its roots from Moses's British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. And it has been marked by a succession of movements and parties, mostly born out of splits and mergers, and characterized by recurrent internal strife, leadership quarrels, and a culture of violence. Two major political parties have marked its history since World War II, the National Front, which achieved a limited but unprecedented success in the 1970s, yet failing to make an electoral breakthrough, and its successor, the British National Party, which achieved a late and limited but yet unprecedented success at the ballot box, making it the most electorally successful extreme right party in British politics. Its success was short-lived, though, as UKIP deprived it of political space. So today, the extreme right has changed. It is atomized and amorphous. There are no more traditional party structures contesting elections. The English Defence League, the EDL, founded by Robinson in 2009, was already a mutation and Islamophobic street movement born out of hooliganism, not interested in contesting elections. It is now defunct, but there are other groups, splinter groups of former organizations such as Britain First and Patriotic Alternative. Yet they remain highly marginal on the British political stage and are not relevant in terms of membership. However, this does not mean that the extreme right has disappeared. Its ideas are still there, its networks and sympathizers too. It is now less formal and therefore harder to grasp and identify. The recent years have witnessed the emergence of a new form of activism made possible by the development of social media. There's no need for traditional structures anymore. Anyone can engage in far-right politics and activities from their own homes, visiting specialized websites, watching YouTube videos, networking on forums, chat services, and mainstream social media platforms like X or Facebook. Not only is this form of activism simpler and cheaper, it is also protected by the anonymity of the internet, which makes it easier for people to engage without the risk of being ostracized or arrested, and which therefore makes it harder to fight for the authorities. This was clearly reflected in the riots and in the more diverse profile of the rioters, which emerged from first studies pointing to an atypical and more nuanced picture. The riots were not driven by the EDL, Britain First, or Patriotic Alternative, or any other group. It appears that most of those who took part in violence had no known links to the extreme rights, though some of them had. Contrary to what was said then, most of those involved were locals who had radicalized online. This was reflected in the decentralized form of the riots, which did not take place in city centers as usual. They took place in the communities themselves, in the streets, therefore tempting people to go down and take part. Social media played an instrumental role in the riots, just as they're now part of the new extreme right ecosystem coalescing online. This is further amplified by the transnational dimension of social media, with the rise of prominent influencers with global outreach. This was illustrated by the recurrent interventions in the debate of Elon Musk, who contributed to disseminating information and stoking unrest, declaring, for instance, that civil war was inevitable in the UK and legitimizing the riots. Studies show that the UK is very active on far-right websites, ranking second behind the US globally in terms of traffic. This new form of extremism raises new challenges, making it harder to counter than identified organizations. Like moving targets, they are unpredictable, which also makes them more dangerous for the police, as demonstrated during the riots. The extreme right has just thus changed shape and become more organic, while it could be seen as a weakening at first sight, and it is not that simple. The new extremist movement has extended its reach and mode of action thanks to the internet, and moreover, it is now part of a larger right-wing ecosystem with a supply side which has grown and become more diverse, following the rise of the populist radical right in the UK. There has been a mainstreaming of the populist radical right and its political discourse in recent years in the UK, mostly under the agency of Nigel Farage and his successive political parties, directly and indirectly. The populist radical right is much more prominent than the extreme right in the UK. It is also more electorally successful, having succeeded in moving from the margins to the mainstream, contrary to the extreme right. This was illustrated by the election of 5 MPs from Reform UK in the last general election, endowing the party and its leader with an unprecedented degree of respectability. Exploring the role of the radical right in the riots sheds light on the mainstreaming of the anti-immigration discourse in British politics. So what was the reaction of Reform UK's emblematic leader, Nigel Farage, to the crisis, considering that he's been a major agent of the politicization of immigration in the public debate for more than 15 years? Well, the newly elected MP for Clacton chose social media and GB News, where he has his own show, to share his views. With 2 million followers on X, Farage is clearly a major right-wing influencer with considerable outreach. And his successive interventions attracted sharp criticism. In the first video he posted on X on the day after the attack, just as disinformation was spreading quickly on social media on the identity of the attacker, he wondered whether the truth was being withheld from us, thereby contributing to fueling conspiracy theories. Farage seemed to fan the flames of unrest, not only legitimizing the violence as a reaction to fear, to discomfort, to unease that is out there shared by tens of millions of people, but also by adopting an alarmist tone, warning that the worst was to come. In a typically populist radical right rhetoric, he claimed that the riots only proved him right and were merely the result of the elite ignoring the grievances of the people on immigration, despite his own repeated warnings. Farage was also one of the first to denounce alleged 2T policing, explicitly tracing it to Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. And in a clear instrumentalization of the crisis, Farage resorted to scaremongering tactics, whipping up tensions and trying to gain political advantage from this. He was emulated by his fellow MPs Lee Anderson and Richard Tice. While this raises the question of the responsibility of elected representatives, it is not surprising. It is strategic. Nigel Farage was talking to his supporters and to his electorate, is well aware that there is a call to strike. And this is confirmed by surveys showing that the attitudes of Reform UK voters towards the riots were significantly different from other voting groups. There's a very interesting YouGov poll on this, taken at the heart of the crisis, and which points to the singularity of Reform supporters. As you can see, Reform UK voters were the only voting group to support the rider protests the unrest was stemming from, with 8 in 10 saying they supported them to some degree. There was also a significant difference in how the rioters were seen between Reform voters and other voting groups. For Reform voters, the most popular description was people with legitimate concerns, which have viewed as an appropriate label. This clearly echoed Farage's discourse. Rioters was viewed as the right term for 47% of Reform voters, but what is most noticeable here is that Reform supporters were more likely to feel the rioters were patriotic than racist or far-right. Finally, Reform voters were also more likely to blame immigration policy, 95% of them seeing it as a contributing factor, with 82% also seeing immigrants and asylum seekers themselves as responsible, more than the proportion who blamed far-right groups and the 31% who viewed Tommy Robinson as somewhat culpable. So there's definitely a singularity of Reform UK supporters and compared to other parties, which certainly calls for further analysis. Some interesting insight on this can also be drawn from a study by The Guardian into the profile of rioters who came from areas which tended to have higher levels of support for Farage's party, mainly underprivileged areas with a working class background, red wall areas. So there's a kind of porosity here, as this is also the profile of part of Reform voters, the left behind. There was reportedly a strong anti-establishment feeling in these riots, coupled with slogans against immigration. Those two dimensions are in line with the populist radical right discourse. And although Farage eventually condemned the violence and explicitly distanced himself from Tommy Robinson and the extreme right, this is the political ground he has been cultivating and on which he has built his electoral success from UKIP to Reform UK. with his broken Britain rhetoric, stirring up anxieties and fear. There has been a mainstreaming of this discourse in British politics, resulting from a long-term process in which he has been a major agent, but which has progressively extended beyond his successive political parties to the Conservative Party. There has been a gradual repositioning of the Conservative Party along these lines, co-opting Farage's discourse in order to counter what was seen as an electoral threat to the Conservatives on their right. The Tory party has turned into a populist radical right party, with several of its senior figures adopting a similar rhetoric, such as Suella Braverman using words like invasion to describe illegal immigration and warning of a hurricane of migrants to come, with clear echoes of Enoch Powell here. The riots may therefore also be seen as the result of this process of normalization of anti-immigration discourse, in which right-wing traditional media, and not only social media, have also played an important part. This was reflected by the fact that the rioters targeted hotels housing asylum seekers and shouted anti-immigration slogans such as "Stop the Boats," which had been used by the Conservative Party to promote the controversial Wonder scheme designed to tackle illegal immigration and the small boats crossing the channel. In conclusion, last summer's riots can be seen as a new type of riots in several respects, in which social media played a pivotal role. There's obviously a need for more data to fully understand what happened. Yet two main aspects emerge from this analysis. First, exploring the riots has shed light on the broader and more complex right-wing ecosystem in which they operated, a richer political supply side ranging from a new extremist movement, more atomized and harder to grasp, to a stronger populist radical right, which has now secured an unprecedented representation in parliament. But this ecosystem also extends beyond the traditional far right to parts of the Conservative Party. And the recent leadership election tends to show that the Conservatives are unlikely to relinquish this political ground in the near future. Second, this episode testifies to a mainstreaming of the anti-immigration discourse in the UK, a normalization which has extended beyond the far right and its perceived toxicity. It therefore has to be seen as the result of a wider phenomenon. And although Starmer's government was effective in restoring order, the situation remains unstable, as illustrated by the reactions to the recent announcement that the Southport attacker had been charged with terrorism for a separate offence. The reaction of the right denouncing a government cover-up tends to show that it is not ready to change its own political discourse. Nigel Farage seized this opportunity to claim that he had been right all along. The way the new Labour government addresses this and reframes the terms of the debate on immigration will be decisive to avoid further unrest. The far right may feel emboldened by the success of the riots, which represents a major challenge for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll take questions afterwards, if it's okay with you. And so we'll listen to Marc Lenormand in the meantime. Nada, would you like to introduce Marc?
Well, hello, all of you. And thanks, Karine, for this very comprehensive analysis that really sheds light on the complex mechanism behind these riots. And I'm sure, as Vincent said, there will be many questions, but we'll have to be patient, and we're going to leave the questions at the end of the talks. And we will leave the floor or the screen to Marc, who will address the question of anti-racism organization and the British left. And of course, it has a direct link with the riots of 2024, because he's going to analyze the British left discourse reactions in the wake of those racist or extreme right riots of 2024. Marc,
Thank you very much, Madame. And I'm afraid I've sort of slightly changed the title of my presentation. So I will discuss, some of the things you said, but possibly in sort of, second half of my presentation. I'm going to share my screen, if this is okay. Yes. This one here.
Yes, it's working.
It's working, and is it still working if I turn it into a full screen slideshow?
It should.
And can you see the slides changing?
No.
No.
No?
This is where it's not working.
Did you say, you just said no, right?
Yeah, we said no, unfortunately.
All right, so I'm going back to this. So I'm going back to this format. Can I maybe, and how about this? Can you see the slides changing?
Yes.
Yes, great stuff. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I've got a new title for my presentation, which is The Racist Riots of 2024, The Strike Wave of 2021 to 2023, and the Anti-Racist Coalition in the United Kingdom. And I believe it's the third successive title I've given to this talk, okay, since I started discussing it with my colleagues. I hope that you will forgive my fickleness and my inability to stick to a title of my own choosing. Now, this seminar session of MIDIB follows upon a radio show in which all three of us participated in the summer. And as for my own paper, its starting point, the sort of new starting point that I've decided to use, is a question that was put to me by the host of the radio show on France Culture in the summer. As I was, if I remember correctly, discussing the geography of the racist riots, the host asked the questions along the lines of, does the geography of the riots reflect that of the strikes of a few years back? Fair question, you may say. I reacted, however, in a rather defensive way, brushing away the question, saying absolutely no. The trade union movement in the United Kingdom has a strong anti-racist commitment, and trade unionists had nothing to do with the racist writing. Now, fundamentally, I believe that my answer was and remains correct. However, it is also the case that one cannot simply brush away, as I did, any correspondence between the racist writing of the summer of 2024 and the strike wave of 2023, 2021, 2023, by simply pointing at the public positioning and the public statements of various trade unions and trade union bodies on issues of racism and anti-racism. I think a fuller exploration of trade unionism and of its relationship to writing racism and anti-racism is needed here. And I'm going to explain why it is indeed the case that there was little or no correspondence between the geography of the strike wave of the early 2020s and that of the racist riots of 2024, mostly due to riots and modern strikes being entirely different forms of protest. Then offer reflections on who the racist writers were and who the trade unionists are, and finish with some remarks on the anti-racist coalition in the UK today and the awkward positioning of the trade unions and of the Labour government in the summer of 2024. Now, let's start with a comparison of, let's say, the two protest episodes of the racist protests and riots of the summer of 2024 and the strike wave of the past couple of years. Now, this set of maps on the slide, published on the BBC News website on August the 9th, offers a recap of the geographical spread of the racist riots of the summer, whose origins have already been developed by my colleague just before, so I'm not going to go back to the mass stabbing that occurred in Southport in Merseyside in late July. Over the days that followed, episodes of rioting occurred in Southport, then in other towns and cities in the United Kingdom, mostly in England, but not only, mostly in Northern England, but not only, as the maps show. And I'm not using the terms riots and rioting here as words of condemnation, although I have little sympathy to say the least, with the racist rioters. I'm using the terms riot and rioting to refer to a specific form of protest. Per the Oxford English Dictionary, as you can see on the slide, a riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd, an outbreak of violent civil disorder or lawlessness. It is probably not the most conceptual definition ever, but it points at a series of characteristics: the use of physical force or violence, the readiness to break the law, the sudden character of the protest, and collective action as a crowd or mob, itself a loose, insufficiently conceptualized term, which however points to very loose, informal organization, and there I can refer back to what Karine previously said about post-organizational far-right politics. Neither am I using the term riot to suggest random or wanton violence, but rather bearing in mind E.P. Thompson's argument about rioting in the 18th century, of which he wrote, and the quote here is on the slide, "It is possible to detect in almost every 18th century crowd action some legitimizing notion. By the notion of legitimation, I mean that the men and women in the crowd were informed by the belief that they were defending traditional rights or customs, etc., etc." And I'm not suggesting that the entire definition and this entire conceptualization of rioting by E.P. Thompson applies to the racist riots of the summer, but it is a useful reminder that rioting has historically been part of the traditional repertoire of popular protest and was a key tool for workers in the days when collective organization in trade unions was outlawed, especially the first quarter of the 19th century. Indeed, Eric Hobsbawm was able to characterize the machine breaking of the Luddites in the 1810s as, I quote, collective bargaining by riot. Over the rest of the 19th century, rioting tended to decline and give way to less violent, legalized, regulated forms of working class protest and collective bargaining as trade unions were progressively recognized and strike action was legalized and took on a more routine form. Over the past 45 years, under conservative governments from 1979 to 1997, and again from 2015 to 2024, anti-trade union legislation has further transformed strike action in the United Kingdom. Workers can engage into strike action only collectively through their trade union, and a trade union can only call for industrial action if a majority of its members involved support it in a properly organized postal ballot. So there's a whole set of rules regulating strikes, and if a trade union fails to respect any of those legally mandated steps, the employer can go to the industrial tribunal and obtain an injunction against a planned industrial action. What this means is that strikes in the United Kingdom are hardly ever spontaneous outbreaks of collective action by workers. But today, they're always carefully planned campaigns of information and balloting of their members by the trade unions. Campaigns conducted by highly professional national trade unions with advanced legal expertise. So I'm not even going to try and compare the map of the racist riots of 2024 and that of the strike wave of 2021-2023, because we're looking at entirely different types of collective action and protest. Now, you may say, what about the highly professional right-wing activists who spread misinformation about the Southport mass stabbing attacker, called a number of rallies and demonstrations that turned into riots and did participate in the rioting? And this is absolutely true. And again, this is something that was approached by my colleague just before. But there is no evidence to suggest that the riots were entirely planned and organized and coordinated by groups with activists on the ground in every single town and city where a riot occurred. Quite the reverse. On the 25th of September of this year, The Guardian published an investigation into the rioters, using court findings to identify almost 500 rioters and cross-referencing their personal details with other publicly available data. One of the things that stand out is that the majority of people charged in connection with the unrest were local to the disturbances in which they were accused of taking part. Analysis of the home addresses provided by those charged found that 3/4 lived within a 5-mile radius. The maps on the slide are maps of the people charged in relation to rioting in Manchester, Hull, Middlesbrough, and Rotherham. The vast majority of them local people, inorganized local people reacting to the spread of misinformation with anger and violence on the street, targeting minority groups and reprising far-right slogans whispered by far-right activists and social media influencers. We're really looking at a textbook case of rioting, standing at the other end of the spectrum of protest from strikes and what strikes are like today in the United Kingdom. Still, you may say, fine, racist riots and strikes are two entirely different, unrelated phenomena. But why should we conclude that the very same people could not be part of both? Striking with were colleagues in the early 2020s, then engaging in racist rioting with their mates in the summer of 2024. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation about the social profile of the rioters and that of trade unionists in the United Kingdom today. The Guardian investigation, again published on September the 25th, established a broader social profile of the rioters. And I quote from the article, and you've got the graphs that go with this on the slide. I quote, well over half of those charged with offences, most commonly violent disorder, came from the most deprived 20% of neighbourhoods. But social deprivation is not the only commonality. Using census figures, The Guardian found that suspected rioters were also far more likely to live in areas with high levels of poor health. More than a third, 36%, came from the 10% of neighbourhoods with the worst self-reported health levels. More than a quarter, 29%, of rioters came from the 10% of neighbourhoods with the lowest levels of qualifications. Areas that have the most residents with no qualifications or a level 1 certificate as their highest include Hendon and Docks, as well as Bolton Upper Dearne. There was also correlation between where the rioters lived and high proportions of people not in employment. End quote. Deprived, in bad health, often not in employment, and with little or no qualifications. Now, it goes without saying that trade unionists are not exactly wealthy, they're not necessarily in good health, but it also goes without saying that trade unionists are necessarily in employment. It is also the case that following decades of deindustrialization, deunionization, and casualization of employment in the private sector especially, trade union density is higher among employees with the highest education qualifications. It is higher among professionals than it is on average among employees in general. It is higher among public sector employees who tend to have higher qualifications on average. So when we're looking at the racist rioters and at trade unionists as groups, we are looking at entirely different demographics when it comes to employment and qualification. On top of this, the Guardian investigation passes rapidly over other social characteristics, mentioning that only 7.5% of the 2024 sample, the sample of people arrested and charged in relation to the rioting, only 7.5% of the sample are women, meaning that 92% of the sample are men, when today the proportion of female employees who are members of trade unions is higher than that of men. There's also no mention of race in the Guardian investigation, either because the data was unavailable or because it appeared self-evident that xenophobic, immigrant-hating, racist rioters were, well, white. Here again, while the majority of trade unionists are white, reflecting the majority composition of the UK population, and the typical trade unionist, a white woman with qualifications and secure employment, it is also worth noting that in 2023, confirming a long-term trend, in case wondering, the proportion of employees who were trade unionists was highest in the Black or Black British ethnic group. So if you want to think of trade unionism today in the United Kingdom, and again, trade unionism is the only conduit through which anyone can go on strike. If you want to think of who the trade unionists are, you should picture a black woman, typically a black nurse or a black teacher. This is where the demographic center of gravity of the trade union movement lies today. And I'm not saying conversely that unemployed, uneducated white men are racist writers or even potential racist writers, far from it. Nor that one should rule out entirely the possibility that among the unemployed, uneducated, white racist writers, there could have been trade unionists. I'm just saying this is highly unlikely. And I'm aware that I'm looking at probabilities here, and that all I'm establishing is a very high probability that because the social profiles of the racist writers and that of today's trade unionists are so different to the point of being antagonistic, the workers who are trade unionists, many of whom engaged in strike action in the early 2020s, were highly unlikely to be found among the racist writers of 2024. And I think that it matters, not just in terms of, that sort of, quick answer I gave to that radio host in the summer. It matters because I think it should prevent us from any sweeping generalization about the working class or about working class attitude in relation to race and racism in the United Kingdom. As in other countries like the United States, where national agreements over pay and condition have disappeared in entire industries, where entire workforces have been deunionized, where employment has become casualized, where unemployment has been used as a tool to break the collective organization of workers, trade union membership has declined, and there is now an increasing divide. A divide between, on the one hand, the workers working in relatively secure jobs, in industries with generally high trade union density, where workers have access to collective bargaining for pay, rights, and conditions through their trade union. And on the other hand, the workers or unemployed workers working in casualized, non-unionized industries with no similar collective organization. And the difference is not just economic. To return to the point I was briefly making in the introduction, trade unions are also organizations which have developed strong anti-racist commitments, have developed anti-racist platforms since the 1970s, and have been key tools for opposing racism in workplaces and in working class communities. So the decline of trade union organization in many industries has weakened anti-racist activity and opened up new spaces for racist activism in casualized workplaces and battered working class communities. The racist tide flows when the trade unions ebb. Now, and this brings me to the third part of my presentation. If this is the case, that the trade unions have such strong anti-racist commitments, then surely the trade unions would have been central to the large anti-racist counter-protests that assembled on the streets of a number of towns and cities on August the 7th, 2024, in the United Kingdom against planned gathering of far-right militants. Well, yes and no, and mostly no. Some trade unions, like Unison, could find and post pictures of trade unionists carrying banners or flags at the anti-racist counter-protests of August the 7th, as you can see on this slide. Although we're looking more at individual trade unionists going to the protest with a banner of their local branch, rather than at a trade union display of force. If you want to see what a proper trade union presence at an anti-racist demonstration looks like, you can compare with the second photograph on this slide, taken on October 26th, so 3 weeks ago, at a counter demonstration against the far-right activist Tommy Robinson and his supporters, a counter demonstration organized by the umbrella campaign Stand Up to Racism, which some of the largest trade unions in the UK were instrumental in forming and in which they remain active. So you can see the dozens of banners and the balloons and so on. Indeed, if we look again at the anti-racist counter-protests of August the 7th, many of the placards that were on display were indeed Stand Up to Racism placards, through which possibly many trade unionists were involved in the counter-protest, alongside many people who joined the counter-protest without any placard, flags, banners, vests that form the trade union attire. And I don't think that lack of preparation could account for the lack of visible trade union presence on the ground at the counter-protest. Rather, it is due to a deliberate decision by the trade union leaderships for the trade unions not to participate in any of the counter-protests, heeding the warnings of the government against counter-protesters taking anti-racist organising and activity into their own hands. The statement published on August the 2nd, 2024 by the Trades Union Congress, the trade union body for England and Wales, is instructive. It was titled TUC Anti-Far Right Statement, and I've copied some of the excerpts on the slide. I read: far-right thugs have taken to the streets of Southport, Hartlepool and London to attack police and emergency service workers, to target Muslim communities with xenophobic hatred, and to despoil the memories of those whose lives were so tragically cut short. Trade unions have always been at the heart of efforts to unite communities and stand against hate, but the challenge feels even more urgent now, as trade unions will continue to work with our members in workplaces across the country to provide practical support and solidarity and defeat the narrative of hate. Our unions call for an end to the violence and intimidation, and for all those who perpetrate these acts to be brought to justice, and so on. So what's in bold is I put it in bold to indicate that the emphasis here really is on the moral condemnation of the racist writing, which is presented in a more indirect way. The emphasis is on anti-racist work in workplaces, not on the streets, and on the call for justice to be served on the perpetrators of violence and intimidation. And again, the emphasis is not on direct opposition to them, even peacefully on the streets. And it is no surprise that pretty much the same rhetoric featured in the statement published on August the 5th, 2024 by the National Committee of the Trade Union and Labour Party organisation Toulon, which brings together the General Secretaries of the 11 large trade unions affiliated with the Labour Party and the leadership of the Labour Party. So I've copied again some excerpts on the slide. So I'm just reading what's in bold. Racism and violence must be confronted with acts of solidarity in our communities. Those who've caused this violence must be brought to justice, and we will continue to play our part in workplaces and communities to bring workers together and to stand firm against those who sow hatred and division. Again, the emphasis on moral condemnation, on solidarity in workplace and communities, and on justice being served on those who incited and engaged in violence, as was at the time the line coming from the Labour government. And I'll conclude on how this relatively weak trade union response and the absence of any clear trade union commitment to the anti-racist counter-protest of August 2024 was, according to me, fundamentally a reflection of the political circumstances in which the racist riots took place, namely the coming to power of a new Labour government. Although the Labour Party promised to scrap the Rwanda scheme for deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, its manifesto was deliberately tough on immigrants, with so-called asylum hotels being targeted in Labour's attacks on the Conservative record on immigration. So this is from Labour's manifesto 2024, referring to asylum seekers indefinitely staying in hotels, costing the taxpayer millions of pounds every week, calling for an end to asylum seekers. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Labour Party in its manifesto were responsible for the xenophobic, anti-immigrant racist rioting of the summer, which including attacks against hotels housing asylum seekers, such as the infamous attempt to torch such a hotel in Rotherham on August the 4th. Although such rhetoric in the manifesto and in public pronouncements by the Labour leadership and Labour candidates during the campaign certainly did encourage anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK, which is also why the response by the Labour government to the racist rioting broadly eschewed the characterisation of the riots as racist riots and gave priority to a law and order response, singling out violent individuals, saying little of the atmosphere of hatred which the Labour Party and the new Labour government had done little to combat. Such a political positioning intended to counter conservative accusations of weakness on immigration, as well as the threat from the resurgent far right, the populist far right, to use the term offered by my colleague before, in the form of Reform UK. That many of the people arrested and charged following the riots in 2024 came from heavily Reform UK voting constituencies should come as no surprise. But the Reform UK vote share in many towns and cities affected by the racist riots possibly shaped Labour's approach. As for the trade unions, over the past few years, especially since Keir Starmer became Labour Party leader, a number of them have pursued a more autonomous agenda of workplace organisation and industrial action, vesting less hopes in a future Labour government. So it might seem surprising that they should have toed the Labour government line during the riots. I guess that we should bear in mind not only the historical role of trade unions in forming the Labour Party, as well as its financial and financial and organizational links, but it's also the case that the trade unions had and still have major hopes in and expectations from the new Labour government, with the hoped for repeal of anti-trade union legislation, the hoped for investment in public services. And the strike wave of the early 2020s should not make believe that radical trade unionism has been revived. The trade union leaderships themselves do not believe otherwise when trade union figures are still at their lowest level since the 1930s. And until and unless this changes, the alliance with the Labour Party and the adherence to the Labour government line in relation to racism and anti-racism will remain the trade union's best option. And I am finished.
Well, thank you very much, Marc, for this presentation. And as I said earlier, we're going to leave the floor to Vincent, who is going to shift the analysis of the riots from social aspects to cultural dimensions, I think. And I just heard through a back channel that he's also updated the title of his talk. And I'll ask you to give us the new title. I think it's something like Riots in the United Kingdom, Perceived Challenges to Multiculturalism and a Catalyst for Change. And the talk will, I think, cover the period from the 1980s till today.
Thank you very much, Nada. I must say I've just lost my PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it?
Yeah.
I can move maybe to the full screen format, which should be better. And in the meantime, I would like to send a message from Romain, who telephoned me. He has a medical emergency, and unfortunately, this is why he wasn't able to participate. So he apologized profusely, and I must thank Nada for accepting to take over as discussant at the last minute. So thank you very much, Nada. Yes, I must say, I must apologize also for my fickleness, which apparently is something I share with my colleague and friend, Marc, because I changed my title as I was preparing for it. As I was preparing for this talk, and actually my talk is also based on something I intended to do when we were taking part in that program on France Culture in August, and I tried to put the riots into a broader historical perspective. So I tried to stick to that approach, but I realized that the title I had first intended to use was not necessarily fit to render what I wanted to talk about or what seemed interesting to me. So yes. So the aim of this presentation is to put last summer's far-right rights into a broader historical perspective in order to identify a number of specific features and invariants, as well as a number of significant shifts in British society over the past 44 years in relation to diversity. So the central question to this talk is the following: to what extent have the different types of rights linked to multiculturalism in the UK represented a form of challenge, while at the same time serving as catalysts for change? So I've decided I could have chosen actually different periods or sometimes also intermediate periods, but I decided, given the format, I decided to concentrate on the riots of the early Thatcher years, the riots of 2001 in northern cities, and of course, the more recent riots in England and Northern Ireland in 2024. So my colleagues have actually made points about the terminology, but which is actually very important, and the terminology fluctuates or has fluctuated over the past 44 years, and of course riots, uprisings, rebellions, disturbances, unrest sometimes. And of course, riot is a useful shorthand, but it is politically loaded. And sometimes, although there is obviously there are very satisfactory definitions, it is sometimes a problematic term. So I have another definition, which it doesn't differ fundamentally from the one Marc used a few minutes ago, but mine is the following: a violent public disorder, specifically a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace by 3 or more persons assembled together and acting with a common intent. So the term, in the context of the 1980s especially, seems to emphasize the infringement of law and order, and it was a term certainly used by the overwhelmingly conservative press and media in the 1980s in relation to the riots in St. Paul's, Brixton, Lozells, Toxteth, and so on and so forth, and by leading Tory politicians at the time, as we will see. It was a term used also in the House of Commons debates following last summer's 29 violent anti-immigration demonstrations throughout the country, but not so much in the 1980s and 2000s, as we will see. So the term uprising or rebellion is a term emphasizing a reaction to an unjust situation or indeed to a form of oppression. And this was clearly a term favored by the British left in relation to the situation in British inner city areas in the 1980s. Disturbance is a rather neutral term acting as a form of euphemism or meant to describe a sort of objective situation. This was a term favored by the parliament during the parliamentary debates that followed the St. Paul's and Bradford disturbances. So here are screenshots from the House of Commons, from Hansard, so in relation to Bristol disturbance, Thursday, 3rd of April, 1980, in relation to Bradford, debated on the 10th of July, 2001, and on the other hand, in relation to the far-right riots of summer 2024, the term riots appear in the policing response actually published by the House of Commons Library on the 9th of September 2024, interestingly. So if we start, with the riots from the early Thatcher period, the riots occurred at a time when the use of the term multiculturalism was beginning to spread outside activist circles and to be widely used in mainstream media and political discourse. However, the riots were not perceived as a threat to the still nascent British multiculturalism, which was gradually taking shape on the basis of the race relations framework devised between 1965 and, not 1968, but 1976, my mistake. So yes, the three Race Relations Acts. The riots were interpreted by the overwhelmingly conservative press and by some right-wing politicians, let alone by the far right, in terms of the challenge to law and order, epitomized by the clashes between the predominantly, though not exclusively, of course, Afro-Caribbean youths, who were called West Indians at the time, and the police forces. And as underlined by John Solomons in Race and Racism in Britain, the racialization of the 1980-1981 events was evident from the very first confrontation in Bristol on the 2nd of April, 1980. So this was very obvious in the conservative press, both local and national, including in broadsheets. And here are a few examples. So I apologize about the poor quality of the photocopies, but these are photocopies I made in Bristol in 1995, 1996, when I was doing my maîtrise dissertation. So I'm afraid, the photocopies have survived, but the quality is not very good. So this is very clear in the coverage that was to be found in The Sun. 19 police injured in pitched battle with black youths. The Daily Telegraph talked about Black Riot. Okay, someone is joining us, so I'm sorry. I'm also managing entries. So, right. And the Times, hundreds of black youths battle with police in Bristol. And the Western Daily Press, a local newspaper, police and firemen stoned by mob, gangs of colored youths ran wild, looting, stoning police, starting fires. That was in relation, obviously, to Bristol. Western Daily Press was a local newspaper that disappeared about 10 years ago. So I would like to, that's another example. The racialization was also very obvious in the opinion pieces published by the Tory Old Guard in various newspapers after the St. Paul's riots and the Brixton riots. And they perceived the riots as the consequence or the consequences of multiculturalism. And they considered the multiculturalism was a threat to British, if not English, identity. Among those people, there was Ronald Bell, who was MP for Beaconsfield and a member of the Monday Club. So that's one of the most, I found, significant quotations taken from that opinion piece. All the fine words of 2 decades by adding a new dimension to English life through turning us into a multiracial, multicultural society have been said tongue-in-cheek. The West Indians in particular, being lively people working to cluster together in neighborhoods, which they would take over, and with their way of life, would continue largely separate from the English way of life. So racial stereotyping. And the riots in Bristol and then Brixton gave Enoch Powell the opportunity to reaffirm his old apocalyptic views on immigration and on diversity. So this is a video. I hope it will work. I tested it before the webinar, so it should be working.
Powell, I think many of us were struck by your remark in the House of Commons to the Home Secretary, you had seen nothing yet. What did you mean by that?
It wasn't a new remark. I've been telling people that for some years. and whatever lies behind these events will continue to intensify as time goes by.
Inevitably, we will have more violence, you're saying?
Inevitably, unless.
So interestingly, inevitably, unless, of course, unless the measures advocated by Powell since the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 were put in place. That was basically centered on what he called re-immigration, since he was intending to create a ministry for re-immigration or repatriation. And there was obviously a sort of a blurring of the limits between voluntary repatriation and forced or compulsory repatriation, which he called re-immigration. That's what he means when he says inevitably, unless, of course. Sorry, no, we've had enough of Powell, I think, for the rest of the day. However, some conservative frontbenchers, like the Home Secretary of the day, ironically called William Whitelaw, agreed with left-wing MPs like Tony Benn when about the nature of the riots, which they did not perceive as racial. So this is taken from the parliamentary debates. The full reference, unfortunately, doesn't appear. Maybe does not appear on my screen because of the various videos on my screen, but maybe it appears on yours. So Tony Benn said, clearly it was not a race riot, as has been made clear, and as we know from other parts of the United Kingdom, violence is not necessarily confined to areas where there are immigrant communities. It is important that relations between the police and all the communities should be brought out and considered. And Mr. Whitelaw responded, I profoundly agree that all the evidence suggests that it was not in any case, in any sense, a race riot. It is correct to say that. So this was after the Bristol riot. Okay, I'm sorry I don't have the full reference. Well, we find the same thing in some of the media, and of course, we should distinguish between the attitude of the tabloids after the St. Paul's or the Brixton riots, and the more responsible attitude of newspapers like The Guardian, or the attitude of certain TV programs like TVI. And the following excerpt is illustrative of the more responsible and balanced attitude of some of the media.
Incredibly, it happened. In an English street, a bank was burnt out by rioters. The riot propelled St. Paul's Bristol into the headlines. Tonight, from St. Paul's, TVI looks at how such excesses can be avoided in the future. Good evening from St. Paul's, Bristol. Of all the headlines that followed last week's rioting, this surely is the most important for the future. It must never happen again. And yet, if that hope, that determination are to be translated into lasting peace, we must try to understand what caused the violence last week. Not just the immediate spark, but why that spark could lead to such an angry outburst. Today in Bristol, community leaders are meeting together behind closed doors to talk about that very question. And in a few minutes, they'll be joining us in a local community centre to discuss with us the lessons of St. Paul's. And these may well need to be heeded in other areas with high black populations, in cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds, Cardiff. Incredibly, it happened.
Sorry. So yes, a very interesting program, actually. This is just an excerpt, but the whole program lasts about 55 minutes. And there is really a debate between members of the Black community and Conservative councillors, at the time dominated Bristol City Council. And we'll talk about police violence, discrimination. So the interest of the program, that was, he didn't consider the riots in terms of an attack on law and order, but has phenomena having, profound roots and origins, notably, social inequalities and lack of opportunities and discrimination, right? Sorry. So concerning the other aspects I want to talk about, the fact that the riots were used actually as catalysts for change, Well, in the 1980s, obviously they were seen as a challenge to authority and the law for some on the right, a challenge to the British way of life and values, Powell or Ronald Bell. But the riots indeed were the first coordinated expression of social, economic, and cultural needs for the Black community, for Afro-Caribbeans, and they acted as a catalyst for these specific problems to be debated and gradually addressed in the following years through the drafting of the Scammon Report, which investigated, discrimination, or the discriminatory attitudes of the police towards Black populations, the underrepresentation of Blacks in the judicial system, and the Swan Report later on, which served as a basis for the Education Act 1988, and which identified specific needs, among Black and ethnic minority children that were not accommodated by the British educational system until the 1980s. So the riots, in a way, were decisive in the sense that they provided the UK's real entry point into multiculturalism, notably on the basis of the Race Relations Act of 1996, and many of the provisions of the Race Relations Act of 1976, which remained pretty obscure until the 1980s, materialized and were used and served as a basis for equal opportunity measures put in place in the 1980s and 90s. So in that sense, the riots of the 1980s served as catalysts. Now, to move on to my second point, the riots in northern English cities in 2001, they occurred in towns with significant South Asian populations, such as Bradford, Oldham, and Burnley, during the summer of 2001. And these disturbances shared a great many characteristics and had profound social and political consequences. So they all, entailed ethnic tensions between white and South Asian communities, and especially Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, but also, to a lesser extent, between South Asian communities and Black communities, either from the Caribbean or from Africa. And in that sense, given their inter-ethnic dimension, they differed from the inner city riots of the 1980s. The triggers, the specific incidents of violence that ignited tensions were notably clashes following provocations from the far right or racist groups such as the BNP, or accusations of attacks on members of specific communities, which inflamed racial hostility by spreading divisive propaganda in these areas. And that is not so much a common point, obviously, with the riots from the 1980s as with the riots from summer 2024. Police community relations were also obviously one important element, and that was a common characteristic with the inner city riots of the 1980s. Youth involvement was also obviously the involvement of young people from economically disadvantaged groups, both white and South Asian, but also Afro-Caribbean and African. And that was actually the notion of underprivilege was actually reminiscent of what had happened in the 1980s. And the scale of violence and the fact that property was attacked or burned was a common characteristic with the riots from the 1980s. Sorry. So how did the government respond to the riots? Thereafter, the new Labour government, and sorry about the typos, because I finished that presentation quite late and I realized that I should have reread it. I should have reread it more carefully. There are a few missing words or typos. So the new Labour government commissioned the Cantle Report, which emphasized the importance of fostering community cohesion and a strong civic identity centered on shared values. The recommendations included improving interfaith and intercultural dialogue as well, as well as addressing inequalities in housing, education, and employment. And these priorities were not so distinct from the priorities identified already in the 1980s, 20 years earlier. What was new was a discursive discarding of multiculturalism and generally the perceived retreat of multiculturalism, which was to intensify following 7/7 in 2005 with the London bomb attacks. And in 2005, this was a declaration by Tony Blair, which I feel is interesting in terms of the distanciation from multiculturalism. I never know, although I use the term multiculturalism myself, quite what people mean when they talk about multiculturalism. You don't mean people living in the separate cultures and never integrating at any point together. I think that's actually certainly not what I mean by the word. And I don't think it's what most people would regard as sensible. We're very proud of the British way of life, but I'm sorry, people can't come here and abuse our good nature and our tolerance. They can't come here and start inciting our young people in our communities and take up violence against British people here. And if they do that, they're going to go back. Now, if we move on to the far-right riots of summer 2024 in the UK, they presented significant challenges, both immediate and long-term. And the key issues included political, social, and economic repercussions, with experts highlighting several critical concerns. So the rise of far-right extremism, and the riots underscore the growing threat of far-right extremism in the UK. The impact of misinformation through the social media, which played a central role. The economic consequences, as ever, with the riots causing extensive damage to businesses and infrastructure. Social divisions, the violence highlighted deep societal divides, particularly around immigration and integration, the targeting of asylum seeker accommodation, and clashes with anti-racism counter-protesters revealed entrenched tensions. Political fallout, as the events sparked debates on political accountability, with figures like Nigel Farage accused of inciting unrest through inflammatory rhetoric as the riots unfolded, and strain on law enforcement with over 1,300 arrests and numerous injuries among officers. Sorry, but I have to go pretty fast. The Starmer government strategy in relation to these riots has been to uphold law and order while addressing the roots of division and extremism. The government announced a series of measures to address the unrest and its underlying causes. Legal and policing measures, resulting in increased police powers, enhanced judicial capacity, with the additional courts protocol that was invoked and which allowed courts to operate extended hours to deliver swift justice to those involved in the riots. Community engagement. Starmer emphasized that violence targeting minorities was unacceptable and did not reflect the values of British society. So efforts were announced to rebuild trust, including public reassurances to affect communities and a commitment to combating extremism. Legislative changes also were announced. The government is reportedly considering stricter regulations on online platforms to curb hate speech and the organization of violent acts, and addressing, obviously, as ever, socio-economic issues. So if I come to, my conclusions. So a brief recap. The riots that took place in the early Thatcher years in 1980 and 1981 in St. Paul's and later Brixton arose in predominantly Afro-Caribbean inner-city areas, driven by socio-economic deprivation, poor relations between the local communities and the police, and widespread racial discrimination. Although they were mostly seen by the Conservative press as challenges to law and order, and to the British way of life. They did catalyze British multiculturalism through big steps forward, such as the Scarman and the Swan reports. Then the riots that took place in the early and mid 2000s, but to be in 2001, they involved ethnic clashes between white and South Asian communities and between South Asian and Afro-Caribbean and African communities, fueled by mistrust, far-right provocations, economic disparities, and middle-class flight. These events questioned the viability of multiculturalism, as shown in the 2001 Council report, which emphasized the need for community cohesion and shared civic values. And the 2024 riots were driven by far-right extremism. They highlighted issues such as misinformation, the role of social media, and organized hate, targeting long-established minorities as well as asylum seekers. The unrest deepened divisions, and Keir Starmer's government responded with law enforcement measures, online hate regulations, and efforts to tackle socio-economic grievances. Now, in terms of convergences and differences, well, the first point is common roots. All series of riots reflected systemic socio-economic issues, alienation, or indeed oppression of marginalized groups, as well as policing shortcomings. Two, the starting points. In the early Thatcher years, riots stemmed from racial inequality and the racialization of black residents. In 2001, riots stemmed from previously unheard of inter-community tensions, underpinned by skepticism towards certain aspects of multiculturalism. In 2024, they were the outcome of ideological extremism and misinformation that had been building up since the Brexit campaign, and that were fueled by shared xenophobia. Three, the responses. Well, responses to the riots of the early 1980s and the early 2000s relied on integration measures, albeit along very different lines. The 2024 responses have underscored the prevention of political extremism and digital regulation. So although it is hard to gauge the impact of the Starmer government's measures meant to combat political extremism, the responses to the three series of riots seem somehow to support British multiculturalism, even amidst decades of criticism, both from the left and the right. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for this very interesting talk. And finally, the time for questions has arrived. Well, we listened to like three stimulating presentations that they all tie together beautifully, and they touch on these riots' political, social, and cultural aspects. One common point that in fact struck me in these three papers is the centrality of the post-organizational background, whether this post-organizational background applies to far-right parties or to trade unions or even to plurality management policies. So would you say that those riots were born from this post-organizational or destructured, this new structure around political parties' ideology, whether the extreme right, the Labour Party, or even the Conservative Party? And this, you're not supposed to answer to this first question, but it's a way to open the floor for questions coming from the public.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm a bit exhausted on my presentation, I must say. So as I'm trying to think, certainly is a very relevant question. I don't know if my colleagues have, well, it seems that a participant has a question. So,
maybe I'll jump in and ask Karine
Amir has a question. I don't know if it's...
Can you hear me, Dr. Latour?
Yes, of course.
Can I go ahead with the question? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I completely agree with you about the point about the 1980s riots. leading to a kind of impetus for British multiculturalism. But my question is about the recent 2024 riots. I was just wondering, what kind of relationship do you see between these riots and the proliferation of pro-Palestinian protests across Britain? There seemed to be a kind of connection, especially Elon Musk's intervention, and also Tommy Robinson, in the sense that it seemed to be directed against those pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So I was just wondering about your reaction to that. Thanks.
Well, I'm no expert on the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, but I did read about that connection. That yes, they came as a sort of a reaction to the many demonstrations that were happening in the UK in the in July and August. I don't know if my colleagues have a more maybe perceptive opinion about that. Marc?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything really perceptive to say, especially since I'm sort of I'm really not especially of the far right, so I'm sort of guessing at what the far right might have said, at what Amir referred to in his question. So if I understand correctly, it is the case that even before the riots, or at the start of the riots, a number of far right activists and influencers pointed at the pro-Palestine demonstrations, saying that these pro-Palestine demonstrations were themselves bringing sort of civil unrest to the streets of Britain. They were themselves sort of racist, anti-British, anti-Jewish racist marches. So in a sense, it is the case that the pro-Palestine rallies and demonstrations and marches which have taken place since last autumn, of the autumn of 2023, have received a lot of sort of negative, hateful response by the Conservative government and Conservative spokespeople at first, and think especially what's her name again, Suella Braverman, especially, who characterised the marches as sort of hate marches. So there was a very negative coverage of those marches, and marches in which there would have been a significant British ethnic minority, Muslim community involvement, not only, again, trade unionists as well. So these marches themselves were portrayed very negatively in sections of the conservative-leaning press, on far-right-leaning social media accounts. And so it is the case that possibly the far-right writers would have seen themselves as having their own sort of pro-British, anti-Palestine, anti-Muslim protests of their own. So possibly that is the case, that, let's say, in the rhetoric that accompanied the riots and sort of made them possible, the existence of the pro-Palestine protest was in itself something that was bandied about. I'm not certain of any sort of further connection between the two.
Yes, maybe if I can add something, just to say that I think that potentially this was one factor which contributed to fueling the two-tier policing narrative. This idea that rioters, rioters here were indeed treated more harshly, for instance, than those in those pro-Palestine marches. So that was certainly used as a key basis of that narrative from the far right, this difference of treatment by the police.
I was going to ask our colleague Nouvelle, who's a specialist of pro-Palestine movement in the Republic of Ireland, if there was a connection between, if there was in any way. We know that marches have been very significant, pro-Palestine marches have been very significant in the Republic of Ireland, and the far right has risen in recent years in the Republic of Ireland. Has there been a sort of a correspondence between the two things? Has the far right been fueled by the pro-Palestine movement in the context of the Republic of Ireland?
Hi. Well, it's quite hard to say. I wouldn't say that there are direct connections, but there are definitely opposing, well, people coming with different views and different ideologies that would oppose each other. But I wouldn't say that there would be, necessarily direct connections and consequences between the strong movement in favor of Palestine in Ireland and the success of the far right at the moment.
Thank you. And sorry about asking the question, but it was very tempting.
Thank you.
Given you're a specialist in the question. So I believe there's a question from Karine.
Yeah, hi, hello. Just two questions. The first one is very quick. Do you know if any official report has been commissioned? You mentioned the Scarman report, Swant report. Is there any equivalent underway, commissioned by the Labour government? So that's my first question. And the other one is, did you hear of any sort of self-criticism of the left, Labour in the UK? The sort of thing we hear about France, that the Labour Party or the left has abandoned a part of the working class. And this is a reference to what Marc said about the fact that we shouldn't really make sweeping conclusions about the working class in the UK. You mentioned the fact that part of the working class is still very much involved in anti-racism with trade unions, whereas perhaps another part of the working class has taken a different path. So is there any form of self-criticism by the Labour Party, in that they perhaps need to address this part of the working class that has seduced by the far right?
Well, perhaps I'll start. I haven't got any sort of answer to the question about the report. I didn't check that. But perhaps about, Karen, your question about the left and the working class. Well, I guess the big debate there is what you do about working class voter who vote for racist far right parties, and obviously, I mean, it appears that the sort of calculation or the sort of play that is the play of the current Labour leadership is to say we're going to go to these voters by not antagonizing them. Hence, in the manifesto again, that rhetoric about very hostile to immigrants, which is a way of sort of competing with the Conservatives and even Reform UK to an extent on their own ground, of saying, well, yes, there is a problem, there is a legitimate concern about illegal immigrants, and we're going to do something about it. We're going to be more efficient than the Conservatives or Reform UK in terms of addressing those concerns and sort of bringing those working class voters who voted for the Conservatives, possibly in 2019, who voted for Reform UK, possibly in 2024, back into the Labour fold. Now, it's the sort of usual question, which is, when you address voters who lean to the right, who possibly adhere to racist far-right theories, and you sort of, to put it sort of negatively, you'd say you pander to their prejudices, or let's say more positively, you try and address their concerns, is it going to work? Or is it simply going to amplify their beliefs in those sort of far-right prejudices that prejudice them against immigrants? And I guess that what happened in the summer sort of would not necessarily suggest that repeating and possibly amplifying anti-immigrant sentiment is necessarily going to work to Labour's favour. So I guess that's the sort of hope that the current leadership has, and it's definitely is not the sort of attitude that was adopted by the previous Labour leadership and Jeremy Corbyn. But again, Jeremy Corbyn's the case that could be made against Jeremy Corbyn was that he was only speaking to that sort of progressive centre-left base, many of whom would indeed be sort of, you know, left-wing progressive trade unionists, and he was not speaking to that other constituency. So I guess that's the sort of question as to how can you both continue to speak to your own centre-left progressive constituency while also addressing that constituency that has sort of strayed into sort of far-right anti-immigrant sentiment. And I guess the debate between the left and right within the Labour movement is whether you take the fight and you take anti-racist organising into those places, into those constituencies, make the case against far-right ideas, or you simply sort of copy and adopt some of those anti-immigrant ideas and hope that people will sort of, you know, come back into the fold and they will be simply convinced by the brand new economic policies of the Labour government, and then we'll simply bring them back and make them happy and they'll stop being racist. And that's a sort of big, I think, debate on the left and not just in the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have like 3 questions, but I wasn't here to see who asked first. So maybe we're going to start with Agnès Collier, who's first on my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all of you for this very interesting papers and presentations. I guess my question is more about the far right, and to Karine possibly, and maybe Marc and Vincent might like to comment on that as well. I'm just puzzled about what you call the mainstreaming of far right ideas in British politics. Of course, this is an endless question. And I was wondering, first of all, if you had any thoughts about how far-right movements reacted to the election of Kemi Badenoch as leader of the Conservative Party in terms of her positions, but also in terms of her image, of course, as a Nigerian woman. And my second question, which is reversely, what are your thoughts about the presence of Reform UK and what it means to perhaps not necessarily the Conservative Party, but, you know, major political parties in terms of realignment around identity politics and immigration policies? If you had any thoughts about that, not necessarily Karine, but I mean, Marc and Vincent as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Agnès. Maybe I'll start. That's a very good question about Kemi Badenoch. I haven't read a specific, any specific content on this reaction on this. I guess that was expected. So, and about Reform UK more precisely, I mean, they're not impressed anymore by the Conservative Party standing on this political ground, because Nigel Farage thinks that he's in fact in a better position to fight this political ground. So that's you won't say that is of course that the Reform UK may be affected. I'm not sure that's the case, and I think that there is certainly a need from the Conservative Party, and here the election of Kemi Badenoch as leader indeed demonstrate that the Conservative Party is not willing to indeed relinquish this repositioning on the radical right. And this is, of course, potentially damaging for the party, because it also has to attract voters from the centre to, in fact, if it actually wants to be elected next time potentially. But I think that Reform UK is also a threat, and that was the riots also illustrated. This is also a threat to the Labour Party, to the Labour government, and the way they're going to. And this echoes what Marc was saying earlier. That is to say, the way that the Labour Party is going to frame the debate on immigration and the policies it's going to introduce, and how it can actually convince those voters, particularly some of them, the left behind, right? So how it can convince them to return to the Labour fold and not to vote Reform UK. So there is clearly here really competitive, I think, political stage, and Reform UK is now, I think, a threat also to the Labour Party in that respect.
Yeah, I think this is what Marc suggested, in dealing with this tension between, you know, looking both directions for constituencies that were concerned about race issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Vincent, Marc, would you like to answer, or shall I take another question?
I was going to say perhaps a quick one, but I'm not very good at quick answers or quick anything. So just to say, you know, in relation to identity politics, if I got Anis's question correctly, so that I guess that one of the things that could also be said among the many sort of contexts in which we may want to inscribe the riots of the summer, there is also the long rise of English nationalism over the past, let's say, 15 years, and that in the 2010s, this rise in English nationalism has been also amplified by the constitutional crisis of the Scottish independence referendum, of the Brexit referendum, and the following sort of fallout over membership of the EU. So there's been a sort of long-term increase in English nationalism as perhaps the nationalism around which politics in England has to an extent been realigned. And the Conservative Party have been very good throughout the 2010s at sort of using that realignment around English nationalism to capture English voters at successive elections. And again, the Labour Party, among the things that under Keir Starmer, the Labour Party did was to try and project itself as the party of English nationalism, wrapping themselves in the UK flag, but also talking up the military and really presenting themselves as the party of patriotic English voters, which you could say is identity politics, but is simply also about the transformations of identity politics. I guess one could argue that, you know, the very idea of something as the Labour Party is identity politics originally, but with identity, the identity around which people were supposed to congregate being working class identity. So it's also about here shifting identities around which political realignments are taking place. So that's very schematic and that's right. I try to keep it quick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. Vincent, would you like to?
No, it's fine.
We'll move on to another question. Then, Berk.
You have to turn on your mic, Axel.
Sorry. My first question is more about the first presentation, I guess. I just wanted to know how does rioting translate when it comes to voting? Because if I understood correctly, rioters took the cue from social media, not from political parties. I mean, Farage only co-opted the event. He did not commanded the events. So how did rioters vote in the 2024 general election? And if not that much, if they did not go to the polls that much, do you think like street action could transform into political action? Could street action, riots, become an entry to a more traditional form of political action in the future?
You mean normalization of street action, is what you were saying at the end?
Yeah. Could like mobilization in the streets be transformed into normal, regular political action, like become a member of a party and something like that?
Okay, I'd say that first that in fact no one commended the riots and no one owned the riots. So whether it be Nigel Farage or the extreme right, so that's very clear. And it was the result of various factors, and it was certainly then exploited by the far right in general. And then in terms of voting behavior, that's of course too soon to answer the question. But if you the YouGov in fact study that I showed earlier actually demonstrate that there is at least now a porosity between Reform UK voters and some of the rioters. I mean, this is too early to be really sure about that and to be really precise. So but just there is a very clearly a porosity between both groups and a similar profile in certain respects. But we also know that there is also a great deal of abstention, as you were also implying in this electorate. So that's too soon, in fact, to have precise answers. But I guess that yes, part of the Reform UK voters, but not only, maybe other groups, and also yes, voters who are disillusioned with politics and who don't vote, actually.
Okay, thank you. I think there's another question from Matt.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this is the best type of question. It's more about the methodology of the first Madame Tournier-Sol's presentation. I just wondered if you could slightly break down your corpus for me, because I was trying to do a similar project for a Masters 1 research project, and I was having problems coming up with a corpus that hadn't been, deleted from the internet or something. So I wondered if you could just subtly break down what your corpus was, if that's possible.
Yes, sure. I worked mostly, of course, on newspaper articles, because it is very recent, and on various studies, but also on, yes, the first and the same study that was used by Marc in his presentation. That is to say, the study from the Guardian in September, into the study into the profile of rioters, which is very, I think, very interesting and very enlightening on what happened. And then I worked also on some of the sources that were actually mentioned in the PowerPoint, that is to say, specialists of the radical right and of the extreme right on various aspects. So yes, those studies, and also this YouGov, I think, survey, which was also very interesting on Reform UK voters and their singularity.
And for things like Andrew Tate and Tommy Robinson, was it just Twitter posts?
Yes. In fact, I read their Twitter posts at the time, and then yes, I searched more precisely afterwards. But when I actually followed them at the time of the riot, so I kind of
Okay.
at the time, yes.
Yeah, I find it's very hard to find this information later. At the time,
Yes.
yeah.
In fact,
Because it's all
yes,
deleted, and I can't use it because I can't find it.
Yeah, I found it at the time, so yes, maybe, yes.
Okay. Perfect, that answers me perfectly. Thank you.
Do we have more questions, additional questions, thoughts, comments? No. Well, that's all. Thank you for this interesting Q&A session, Vincent.
I just wanted
would you like, please, to take over from here?
Yes. Thank you very much for taking over at the last minute and for doing it brilliantly. Thank you very much, Nada. Well, I just wanted to say that we're in the middle of finalizing the program for semester 2. So you'll be kept informed very quickly about the upcoming sessions, from January onward. And as usual, this session will be actually uploaded on our blog, which once more contains all the contributions we've had since 2021, and there are quite a few. I think it's over 40 presentations. So it's a very interesting source for ourselves, but for our students as well. So do not hesitate to refer your students to our blog and to previous presentations, because we've had very interesting talks so far. So thank you very much for making yourselves available at a very busy time of year and of the term, and see you very soon for the next sessions of our webinar in the second semester. Thank you very much.
Thank you.